I think a number of things are clear. They're always made clear when violence erupts in Palestine. What is made clear is a Christian-inspired hatred of Jews that goes back 18 centuries, which to me is totally insane, because the primary figure in Christian mythology is a Jew, is Jesus of Nazareth, a part-time rabbi. I've never been able to understand why insane Christians have been so anti-Semitic. And they have been. Let's not mince words here. I'm not going to issue qualifying statements. You know this as well as I do. This is where anti-Semitism comes from. Goddamn sure doesn't come from Hindus. It doesn't come from indigenous peoples' religions. It comes from Christians. Oh, okay. It also comes from a few Arab-speaking countries too, and there's a reason for that. But it has its genesis in the bigotry and hatred that comes from Christians. It just does. We can argue until hell freezes over, but it does. You know it does. So this bigotry against Jews, as soon as something like this happens in the Middle East, and it happens repeatedly, that bigotry emerges. Like I said, it's a monster. On the other hand, you have what has been referred to over and over and over and over and over again for 75 years as, quote, the rights of the Palestinian people, end quote. How many times have you heard that phrase? I've heard it many, many times. Do the Palestinian people have rights? Are they not human? Who was the black woman? Was it Sojourner Truth who said, am I not a woman? Was it her? The Palestinians, do they not stand up in their way of saying, am I not a human being? Entitled to the same sense of dignity and self-respect and the ability to live a life as a non-Palestinian. And it doesn't matter if that non-Palestinian is Muslim, Jew, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu. It makes no difference. This religious shit is killing us. It's killing us. Spiritually. It's killing people literally now in Israel, Palestine. And it has been. I do not harbor any kind of respect for terrorism. I don't care if it's the Irgun, the Jewish terrorist group that fought for the independence or the establishment of the State of Israel, or Hamas. Hamas that invades villages in Israel and slaughters children, or Americans who firebomb cities in order to diminish support for a militaristic regime that we're at war with. No, I don't support terrorism on any level. It is the most inhumane or unhuman, in my opinion, thing people can do. Terrorist acts where children, adults are slaughtered for some attempt to make some sort of religious or political statement. And once that happens, then that bloody, gory, horrific seesaw begins. You kill my children, I'll kill yours. Well, then I'll kill more of yours. Okay, then I will kill more of yours, goddammit. If this isn't insanity, if this isn't madness, then there is no such thing. But what is going on in Israel, Palestine right now is unbelievably brutal and disgusting and bloodthirsty. There was a hearing this morning in the Senate attended by Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, as these two Americans, Biden administration figures, made their appeal for more money for Israel and Ukraine. And as the hearing began, there were probably 25 protesters sitting in the visitors gallery, or whatever it's called, in the audience, who raised their hands and with the palms pointed towards the podium where all the senators were sitting. And it was during Anthony Blinken's opening remarks, or his statement. And he, of course, could not see the hands unless he turned around, but they were covered in red paint or food coloring or whatever. But as these 25 people held up their hands, they looked like the hands were bloodstained, which was exactly the point that the protesters were trying to make. And they were chanting, "Ceasefire now." These were not anti-Semites. A number of people in this demonstration self-identified as Jews and Christians. They were young people and old people. And they were making their point in the most effective venue that they could. They knew there would be television cameras. They knew there would be senators. They knew there would be the Secretary of State and Defense, secretaries of both. And they did the American thing, protested, not violently, but loudly, chanting their slogans until each was led out of the Senate chamber, gently, I have to say, by the Capitol Police. And the hearing went on. And the people who did not stand up and start chanting their slogans remained seated with their hands raised in the bloody palms, alleged blood, symbolic blood, pointed towards the senators. The protest was absolutely appropriate. And they weren't asking, these protesters, for anything other than a stopping of the slaughter. These are people who believe in peace. I believe in peace. Do you? Of course you do. I think the Palestinians believe in peace. I think the Jewish citizens of Israel believe in peace. Then why don't we have it? Well, there are varied reasons, varied answers to that question, as you well know. But any time, and there have been several occasions where, as a talk show host or somebody working in media, journalist, whatever, I have borne witness to, well, it started with the first so-called intifada back in the 80s, when the Palestinian young people took on Israeli tanks, and the Palestinian young people had rocks. That was before Hamas, I think. That was before these Islamic organizations determined to destroy Israel had taken a definite form or shape. I may be wrong on that. You know, there's a lot of this history of the last 40, 45 years that have been so shocking and horrifying to me that I maybe have blocked it out. I don't know. But I remember the first intifada. And then I remember the second intifada. I remember the violence that has always developed between the Palestinians, Palestinian Arabs, and Palestinian Christians, and the Israeli Jews. Ongoing, constant. And the Israeli response to that was to tighten even further the restrictions placed on the Palestinian people. Look, you don't have to be a weatherman to know which way the wind is blowing, and you don't have to be an expert on human psychology to understand that when a population of people is condemned to what they think is a form of imprisonment and denial of their rights as human beings, eventually there is going to be violence. How many times have we seen this? We've seen it in this country. We've seen it in South Africa. We've seen it in the Eastern European countries. We saw it at Tiananmen Square. We've seen it in Israel over and over again. We saw it in Ireland between the Catholics and the Protestants. When people start to feel that they are being choked to death by what they consider to be an occupying power, eventually it will explode. Even in the Warsaw Ghetto, even when in World War II, when the Nazis had condemned tens of thousands of Polish Jews into a open-air prison, eventually the Jews revolted. They were slaughtered to the last person, yes, but revolted. They said, no, fuck you. We are not do this. We are not going to allow this to happen to us. There is no question in anyone's mind who follows the Middle East. There's no question that this was going to happen. That this cataclysmic, apocalyptic explosion of death and blood and slaughter was going to happen. You cannot contain a people for 75 years, forcing them to live under what can only be identified as an apartheid system and expect them to remain docile and accept their lot endlessly. Now, this is not, this is where I hesitate to get into this discussion, and I have hesitated over 35 years of being in radio. Because what I say can be instantly labeled as either anti-Semitic or anti-Palestinian or pro-Jewish or pro-Muslim. And I try not to slip into that kind of a frame in what I say. It never works. I've been labeled all of that. I think one of the worst times in my life was back in the 90s. I think it was in the 1990s. When the head of the ADL here in Atlanta, someone I knew. I mean, we weren't drinking buddies, but I knew him. And he wrote a piece for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that was talking about anti-Semitism. I think this was during the second Intifada. It might have been the first. I honestly don't remember. But this man, the head of the Atlanta ADL, labeled me as an anti-Semite. Now, there was a strong reaction from the dozens, if not hundreds, of Jewish friends I had here in Atlanta, coming to my defense. That was not material to me. What was material to me was the fact that someone could interpret my statements about the plight of the Palestinian people as being anti-Semitic. But I understand it now. I didn't understand it then. I didn't understand how that could happen, how I could be labeled as anti-Jewish or a Jew hater because I took a position that the Palestinian people had the same rights as Christians, Jews, Mongolians, people who live in Ecuador. It doesn't make any difference. And they were living, these Palestinians, in a situation that was choking them to death, little by little, choking them to death. So I've been down that path of trying to talk about this issue and knowing full well when I started to talk about Malloy, you're going to be labeled either this or that. You better be careful here. And I try to be careful. But I can't not talk about it. I can't not address the slaughter of people. Look, the leadership of Hamas does not even live in Gaza. Why does the IDF not do what the United States should have done after the attack on 9/11? And that is contain the rage and the anger, if possible. I know. I'm talking like a man with a paper ass right now. I understand that. I'm not a Jew. I'm not a Palestinian Muslim. I'm just me. And I can't get inside the minds of these people who absolutely have come to the point where they hate each other on a visceral level, where they're willing to slaughter each other's children. Think about this. God damn it. When the disgust and contempt and hatred reaches that level where this group, the adults in this group say, I'm going to go slaughter their children. And the adults in this group say, then I am going to slaughter your children only more. If that's not madness, madness does not exist. But I know that in trying to talk about this, I'm going to feel that feeling once again. I'm going to get emails. I'm going to lose listeners. I know that. And there's nothing I can do about it. Because to avoid talking about this would be an act of cowardice on my part that I simply cannot do. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. You know, the Progressive Voices Network brings you commercial-free commentary from today's leading progressive radio hosts and pundits, like me, Mike Malloy, 24 hours a day. I'm not your typical old guy from the 80s or the 90s talk radio host, and Progressive Voices is not your typical talk radio network. It's a listener-supported nonprofit with no corporate control whatsoever over our broadcast. So hosts like me, Mike Malloy, are free to rant and scream and carry on about whatever we like. We're often controversial, but we're never boring. Weeknights, 9 p.m. in the East, 6 p.m. in the West on the Progressive Voices Network. Always progressive, always on. I'm Mike Malloy. Keep it lit.